And hello everyone, and welcome back to our live stream here. I guess my hotkey actually closes out the window there. We should be good though. All right, hopefully everybody's here. Hopefully you've had a chance to get in. I know that a couple of people have already messaged me saying that they were live, or they were here live, and hopefully you can hear me. If you can't, please let me know, but I think I should be okay to go. All right, got a new microphone now, new technology, so hopefully the stream is even better than it has been. All right. Before we get started, if you have any Bible questions throughout the broadcast tonight, please feel free to post them in the comments. I do have them opened up on a second screen. I am looking for them. I'm watching for them. So if you have any questions or comments or whatever, feel free to drop them over there to the side or below if you're on your phone, and I will do my best to answer them if I have opportunity. Obviously, I can't always do that, but I will definitely try. Today we are in Zechariah chapter 13, and we have entered into the future aspect of the book of Zechariah. A lot of what Zechariah was talking about, in fact, a lot of what most prophets talk about, aren't future events, but contemporary events to them. They were more contemporary critics than they were foretellers of the future. Now, there are places in the Bible where they do prophesy in the way that we typically think of it, in terms of looking forward to the future. But the prophet was just a spokesperson for God, and most of the time, the things that the prophets talked about were events that were relative to them, that events that were contemporary to them, events that they were going through right then. Like I said a second ago, one of the prophet's roles was oftentimes critiquing the present situation in Israel or in Judea or in the wilderness or in Egypt or wherever. When you think back to the prophet Moses and the prophet Aaron and the role that they played in the Exodus, they did very little fortune telling or future telling. They mainly gave God's message to the people as it was, as the events were unfolding before them. Zechariah does a lot of the same thing. Most of the book of Zechariah isn't prophecy like we think of it, but contemporary criticism of the temple being built, of the return from exile, of the neighboring nations, all the things we've discussed so far. But we've entered into a section of the book of Zechariah, beginning in chapter 12, but we've seen flashes of it as we've been moving through the book that appears not to be strictly contemporary, but looks more towards the future. Specifically, what we would call, it's concerning the subject called eschatology, a word that we use sometimes here on a broadcast, which simply means a study of the last things. And so many people look at Zechariah 12 through 14 as being passages having to do with the last days or the end times or the millennium or however you want to phrase it. Hello, Miss Anita. Thank you for joining me this evening. And hello, Dale. I know you're there as well. Good to see you as well. Thank you for stopping in. So Zechariah 13 is situated within this future prophecy, the way that we typically think of prophesying. Now, I say that to say this. Hey, Leslie, how are you doing today? In the New Testament, there are a lot of prophets. For example, in Ephesians chapter 2, it says that the church is built upon the foundation of the apostles and the prophets. That's actually Ephesians chapter 3, I believe. Let's see. I was kind of going off my memory there. It's Ephesians 2. The whole house is built upon the foundation of the apostles and the prophets. These were not necessarily future, tellers, like foreseeing the future, but contemporary critics, spokespeople of God, commenting on the current situation in the current day. And so one of the things I like for us to do is rethink the way that we view prophecy, the way that we view the role of a prophet. In 1 Corinthians 13, for example, it says in verse 8, "Love never fails. If there are gifts of prophecy, they'll be done away. If there are tongues, they will cease. If there is knowledge, it'll be done away. We know in part and we prophesy in part." See, this is not necessarily talking about future telling, but it's, again, God's revelation to the people. And it was necessary because they only knew in part. So they know in part and they prophesy in part. But prophesying here is not necessarily telling the future. Okay? All right, let's get back to Zechariah chapter 13. A little bit about prophets there. But in Zechariah 13, we have it's a passage, apparently, about a future time when the house of Israel would be cleansed of their sin and their impurity, as we see in Zechariah 13 and verse 1. So let's read. In that day. I've mentioned to you before that this expression, in that day, at least it seems to me, it calls back to the previous section. For example, in that day, as we see there in verse 11 of chapter 12. Let's see. Verse 9, in that day. Verse 8, in that day. We have this all throughout this text. Verse 6, in that day. So we have this reference throughout Zechariah 12 through 14, but the same thing is true for passages like Isaiah 2 through 4, Isaiah 25 through 27, even the book of Revelation. We have this kind of language that hints continuity from one chapter to the other. And so I tend to read Zechariah 12 and 13 together because of this element. In fact, as we look at some of the statements that are made throughout Zechariah 12 through 14, we will see that they are often quoted from in the New Testament. For example, in Zechariah 12 and verse 10, we have this expression, so they will look on me whom they have pierced. This is obviously quoted by John 2 times, once in John 19 and the other in Revelation 1:7. As we look here at the end of verse 10, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only son. They'll weep bitterly over him like the bitter weeping over a firstborn. G.K. Bill and Dr. Carson, in their commentary on the New Testament's use of the Old Testament, they indicated that Matthew 24:30 and Revelation 1:7 both allude to this passage in their writings. So there's a lot of references to this section of Scripture. One of them, for example, comes from Zechariah chapter 13 and verse 7. Matthew and Mark quote from this passage to talk about the crucifixion of Jesus. Actually, specifically, it's talking about the fact that the disciples forsook Jesus and fled when he was being tried to be crucified. Zechariah 13:7 says, "Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, and against the man my associate, declares the Lord of hosts. Strike the shepherd, that the sheep may be scattered, and I'll turn my hand against the little ones." So this is, this is referenced twice in the New Testament, once in Matthew and once in the book of Mark. The specific passages are Matthew 26:31 and Mark 14:27. Matthew 26:31 and Mark 14:27. When you get into Zechariah chapter 14, there's a lot of references that we have to the New Testament. Just for example, in Zechariah chapter 14 and verse 2, we read, "I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city will be captured, and the houses plundered," etc. And then as you move down through this passage, we have the Lord appearing with all of his saints. As we'll see in a couple weeks, we have the day being only known to the Lord, living waters flowing out of Jerusalem. Let's see. The Lord will be king over all the earth. So you have a lot of passages in this text that are, again, referenced and alluded to in the New Testament. So I take Zechariah 12 through 14 as to be a text that is purely eschatological. There may be some commentary or applicable sections within talking about the present situation and rebuilding the temple in the post-exilic period, but I think that this passage is more focused on the New Testament times and the ministry of Jesus and the ministry of his apostles and the building up of the kingdom of God and restoration of Israel through the Holy Spirit. So that's how I take Zechariah 12 through 14, just to give you sort of the context of the passage. So let's begin. Zechariah 13 and verse 1. We read, "In that day a fountain will be opened for the house of David and for the inhabitants of Jerusalem for sin and for impurity." Okay, a couple things about this passage. One, when he says a fountain will be open, The idea there is a fountain of water. Water will flow for the inhabitants in Jerusalem. This is alluded to as well in Zechariah chapter 14. Oh, and we just had it there. Oh, let's see. Zechariah 14 verse 8, where living waters flow out of Jerusalem. All right. So we have this continual theme in the Old Testament and in the New about the living waters flowing, fountains being open for the house of Israel. Notice he says it would be open for the house of David and for the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Notice that this expression here is not new. If you go back to Zechariah chapter 12, notice, for example, verse 10. I will pour out on the house of David, on the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So, again, house of David, inhabitants of Jerusalem. You look down here at verse 12. Who's mourning? The house of David. And then he goes on to say, all the families of the land, all the families of the people. Zechariah 12, verse 8. The Lord's going to defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem and the house of David. So we have continual references in verse 6 as well to the house of David, to the house of Jerusalem, or the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Again, there, verse 5, the house of Judah. All right, so this is the same group of people under discussion within this passage. Those who looked on him whom they pierced in verse 10 and mourned over him as one mourns for an only son, receive forgiveness in Zechariah 13 and verse 1. Those who mourned for the one whom they pierced are offered forgiveness in Zechariah 13 verse 1. Specifically, a fountain will be opened for them for their sin and for their impurity. Notice the cleansing of the flesh theme here in Zechariah 13 and verse 1. This is similar to a lot of the passages that we've studied in recent weeks about the water of life. For example, in Ephesians 5 and verse 21, we read this about Christ and the church. He might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word. So this washing of water, this cleansing ritual, is used over and over again in both New and Old Testament to symbolize the forgiveness of sins. And that's why we practice Christian baptism, immersion, because it does the same thing. It symbolizes the washing away of the, we think of a bath as washing away the filth of the flesh, and this is washing away sins, is the way that it is viewed. Now, when he says impurity there, this is a word that's used often in the Old Testament. Let me bring you. Oh, search it. There we go. Let me bring it over to you here. So you see it's used a lot of the times, interestingly enough, about the days of a woman's menstruation. So it's kind of interesting that it's used in that way. But throughout Numbers, this impurity, this uncleanliness, as you see, it's used in Ezra. Basically, this is something that would come about, when they were ritually unclean. So they'd have to go through a purification process. So again, this is drawing from this theme of Israel being in captivity among the Gentiles. Another good passage that talks about a similar idea is in Ezekiel 16 and verse 4, where he says, "As for your birth, on the day that you were born, your navel cord was not cut, nor were you washed with water for cleansing. You were not rubbed with salt or even wrapped in cloths." So they were born there. They were squirming in their own blood, as he says in verse 6, and he said to them, "Live," right, in verse 7. So again, the creation and okay, well, that's a very that's a very kind comment somebody left. I don't even know what he's talking about, but whatever. So the creation of Israel and the reconciliation of Israel is often used to talk about the cleansing of sin, or cleansing off them being among the Gentiles, them being out of the land, basically. All right, so Zechariah chapter 13 and verse, verse 1. So the washing away of the sin and the impurity is another thing that we have elsewhere in Scripture. For example, in Isaiah 27, her reconciliation, like in Isaiah chapter 27 and verse 9, is related to her judgment. So one of the things that we have in Zechariah that I've pointed out to you over and over again is that reconciliation and judgment are paired together often. So like in Zechariah 27:9, what we read is this: "Therefore through this Jacob's iniquity will be forgiven, and this will be the full price of the pardoning of the sin, when he makes all the altar stones like pulverized chalk stones, when Ashram and incense altar will not stand, the fortified cities isolated," etc., etc. So judgment and purification or reconciliation are often paired together in the prophets, and even in the New Testament as well. But that's going to be for a later discussion. Let me show you one more here. Romans chapter 11 is a passage that draws from Isaiah chapter 25 and verse 7. And if we look at verse 25, here's what he says: "I do not want you, brethren, to be uninformed of this mystery, so that you will not be wise in your own estimation, that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel will be saved, just as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion, he will remove ungodliness from Jacob, and this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins." Now, this passage here, Romans 11, 25 through 27, is a passage talking about the restoration of Israel. But if you notice in verse 26, 1, he says that all Israel will be saved. And 2, in Isaiah 59 and verse 20, the passage that he's talking about, one of the things that the Redeemer was coming to do for Israel was to come to Zion and to those who turn from transgression in Jacob, right? So he's coming to reform them. He's coming to change them. He's coming to reconcile them to himself by abiding by his covenant, by being faithful to his covenant, and taking away their sins. Now look at verse 28. He says, "From the standpoint of the gospel, they are enemies for your sake, but from the standpoint of God's choice, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable." Or irrevocable. I've heard people say it both ways, but whatever. Just the point of this is, as we see here, is that God has his covenant with Israel. And he says in Romans 11, 25 through 29, that he's going to fulfill that covenant. And what that involves is taking away their sins when the deliverer comes from Zion. The coming of the Lord, which is typically looked at as being a time of judgment, is pictured in Paul as being a time of deliverance, as it is in Zechariah 13. As we're going to notice later in the passage, the judgment does occur. All right, hang on. Banned. Put him in timeout, whatever. 300 seconds, that's not enough. You need to go to eternal conscious storm. I'm just kidding. Let's see. There we go. All right, he's done. That's okay. All right. A 300-second timeout wasn't good enough. We had to be a little bit more strict, because I got to focus and not mess with crazy people. Okay. Zechariah chapter 13 and verse 1. Yeah, so sin and impurity, the removal of sin and impurity takes place at a time of judgment. The judgment and the reconciliation are often paired together in Scripture. But this is what we should expect from how we treat our children, how bosses treat their employees. You punish for the purpose of reconciliation. And a lot of the judgment passages in the Old Testament, like Amos, for instance, talks about this, that the reason why God was removing the rain or removing the food or whatever, or sending an army, was not for the purpose of obliteration, was not for the purpose of eternally casting them away, but was for the purpose of reconciling them. It was a corrective measure that God was using in order to try to save Israel. And this is what we have in Zechariah 12 through 14 as well, as we're going to continue to see. So he says in verse 2, "It'll come about in that day, declares the Lord of hosts, that I'll cut off the names of the idols from the land, and they will no longer be remembered. And I'll also remove the prophets and the unclean spirit from the land. All right? So this is an interesting passage, and one that a lot of people need to rethink or re-examine. I need to rethink and re-examine it for sure. A lot of people have used this passage to talk about the removal of the prophetic office and the removal of the unclean spirits, like the casting out of the spirits in like the book of Acts and stuff like that. I don't know if that's the most precise way to read this passage. I know that's what we want it to say. I know that's what people, that's how people want to use it, how I want to use it, but I don't think we should use it in a way that the text does not allow. When you examine the passage, it seems to me, at least, that he's not talking about all prophets in this particular case, but specifically false prophets that were leading the people away. I think that's specifically what he's talking about. As for the unclean spirits in the book of Acts, possibly could be talking about the unclean spirits that you see like in the Great Commission. However, another idea is this. The word unclean, as we mentioned a second ago, this is not the same word but similar to it, has reference to ceremonial uncleanliness, like in the book of Leviticus, as you see there on your screen. All right. So removing the unclean spirit seems to be the opposite of this in verse 10, the pouring out of the spirit of grace and of supplication. So it's basically a transformation of Israel from this unclean spirit that they received in exile to this spirit of grace and of supplication, right? In exchange for an unclean situation to a clean one, because of the pouring out of the Spirit. So that, I think that's possibly a better way to look at it. Could it be talking about the demons or whatever in the book of Acts and the Gospels? Possibly, maybe. This seems more likely because of the context, but I'm not going to count out the others. So I just want to kind of throw that at you and see what you think, okay? Now, when he says he'll remove the prophets from the land, again, if we look back at the context of Zechariah 9 through 11, you have these false prophets throughout this passage that cause this flock to be doomed for slaughter. As you see in Zechariah 11 verse 5, those who buy them slay them and go unpunished. Each of those who sells them says, "Blessed be the Lord." So I think that this is talking about false prophets, not just all prophets. Ashley says that the New Living Translation puts false prophets and not just prophets. And I believe the New Revised Standard does as well. I'd have to check that, but I think that's true. I can take a look at it right quick, actually. Yeah, it just says prophets in the New Revised Standard. I was looking at a version a while ago that said false prophets as well, Ashley. So that's a good point. So I think he's specifically talking about the false prophets in this case. All right. So as much as we want to talk about the closing up of the prophetic office, there's more passages in this one that talk about that. All right. Now, in verse 3, he says, "If anyone still prophesies, then his..." Wow, we've been going for 30 minutes already. Yikes, I need to slow down. "If anyone still prophesies, then his father and mother who gave birth to him will say to him, 'You shall not live, for you have spoken falsely in the name of the Lord.'" Again, it's false prophets is the idea here. "And his father and mother who gave birth to him will pierce him through when he prophesies." Pretty extreme language there, but it comes from Deuteronomy chapter 13. And pierced him through is another way to talk about a stoning, is what one commentary I saw there said. Interestingly enough, this word pierce, as I'm about to demonstrate to you here. All right. This word pierce is the same word translated pierced in Zechariah 12:10. Can you see that? Let me blow it up for you real quick. Same word translated pierce in Zechariah 12:10. They will look on me whom they have pierced. So here we have a false prophet, and here we have a true prophet. So the idea in Zechariah 12:10 being compared to Zechariah 12:3 is basically this. here you pierced the true prophet when you should have been rejecting the false prophet, right? From Zechariah 13, verse 3. So, it's sort of an interesting comparison. Basically, giving them this new spirit and taking away this unclean spirit reveals who the true prophets are and who the false prophets are. So you can look at the removal of the prophets not as taking away people that falsely prophesy, but exposing them, exposing the lie through the true prophets, basically, is what it is. Exposing them through showing what a true prophet looks like the Christ. It's a battle between the two prophets is basically a way that you can look at it. All right. Okay, verse 4. Also, it will come about in that day. I really want to get down to this bottom section, man. It's so good. Also, it will come about in that day that the prophets will each be ashamed of his vision when he prophesies, and they will not put on a hairy robe in order to deceive. Hairy robe. You have John putting on a hairy robe. You have Ezekiel, Elijah putting on a hairy robe. And basically this is sort of the uniform of a prophet, right? Is the way that you could look at that. But he will say, as you see in verse 5, I am not a prophet. I'm a tiller of the ground, for a man sold me as a slave in my youth. Do you remember in our studies from the book of Amos? Whoops, all my stuff got flipped around here. Do you remember our studies from the book of Amos? Amos said, I am not a prophet, nor the son of a prophet, right? I'm just trying to herd sheep, and God called me up here to do this. This is basically what the false prophets are saying here in Zechariah 13. Except what they're doing is they're so ashamed of their prophecies that they're rejecting the office, whereas used to they would gladly accept it. But the problem is they've been exposed for what they are. In John chapter 3, that's one of the things that we read that the light does, that Christ does, is exposes the lie, right? That light has come into the world, and men love the darkness rather than the light, for their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light and does not come to the light, for fear that his deeds will be exposed. So Zechariah 13 is about the exposure of these false prophets, right? Okay. All right, verse 6. And one of them will say to him, what are these wounds between your arms? Then he will say, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. So basically, I think Ashley's version, and maybe some of your other versions, may say, those with which I was wounded in a fight at the house of my friends. Might indicate a scuffle going on here in verse 6. The word friends could also be translated those who love me. So this could even be my family. Basically, what he appears to be doing is trying to excuse being pierced through for falsely prophesying in the previous section, is what it appears like to me. Okay, in verse 7, we kind of enter into another section here, a section within the section that's not directly associated with the passage above, at least not directly in terms of the same context. It's within this futuristic section, but it's taking on now a poetic voice. Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, and against the man, my associate, declares the Lord of hosts. Strike the shepherd, that the sheep may be scattered. This is the passage that is quoted by Jesus in the passages from Matthew and Mark that I shared with you a while ago. Specifically, Matthew 26:31, Mark 14:27. Now, he says, and I will turn my hand against these little ones. In the New Testament, at least, this passage was being looked at to talk about the falling away, the temporary falling away of the disciples at the crucifixion of Jesus, them being unwilling to stand by the shepherd. Now, this shepherd theme is one that's been going on for the past few chapters now. He keeps alluding to this shepherd that's going to come and save them and carry them back to the land and save them from these unruly shepherds. And the unruly shepherds are going to be taken away. Now, in verse 8, he reads, it'll come about in all the land. Now notice this, all the land here in verse 8. In verse, in verse 2, he'll cut off the names of the idols from the land. The land is under consideration here. And the land is not the world, the universe, the entire earth, or however you want to say it. The land is specifically the promised land. And so he's going to Do this to the land, declares the Lord. He says 2 parts of it will be cut off and perish, but the third will be left in it. Now, interestingly enough, as I've talked to you before, if you look at the book of Revelation, if you look earlier in Zechariah, there's a lot of discussion in these 2 books specifically about a third of the people being judged, a third of the land being judged, a third of the people being taken into captivity. It's really interesting, all these thirds that are being discussed. One of the things that I think of when I think about the ancient world and how it was laid out in the time of Christ, right? This is a beautiful drawing. And if you don't think it's a beautiful drawing, then you probably should go to an art school or something like that, because there's no way that this wouldn't be considered beautiful, and by basically everyone. So you have Jerusalem here, right? You have Nazareth up here. You have Samaria here. All right, you have the Jordan River to indicate the Jordan River. You're never going to guess. We're going to look at that. That's wonderful. See, you have the 2 seas here. Sea of Dead Sea, Sea of Galilee, right? And this could be what he means by the third, but I don't know. So there you go. Could be, but that's just my guess. I don't know if that's it or not. I just thought I'd let you in on that little thing. So anyways, 2 of these parts will be cut off and perish. All right? But the third will be left in it. Now, why is the third left in it? Notice what he says. I'll bring the third part through the fire. Interestingly enough, in the book of Mark, chapter 9, one of the very last passages in this book, it says this. Mark chapter 9 and verse 49. Everyone, let me just read you the context. Okay. Let's see. You already know what this says. Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe to stumble, it would be better for him if, with a heavy millstone hung around his neck, he had been cast into the sea. Question for you. Nope, never mind. OB, call me. Okay, if you're still here, OB, call me after this is over. Alright, if your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. For it is better for you to enter life crippled than having your 2 hands to go into hell, the Gehenna, into the unquenchable fire, okay? The worm does not die, the fire is not quenched. Okay, if your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off, etc., etc. Eye causes you to stumble, throw it out. Now verse 49, for everyone will be salted with fire. Well, what? Read that. Everyone will be salted with fire. The fire of Gehenna? What fire is this talking about? That's a good question. And I want you to think about that one. Alright, come back to me now in Zechariah 13. Let's come on back. Okay. I'll bring the third part through the fire. Why through the fire? Not to be destroyed, not to be eternally tormented, but to be refined. Refine them as silver is refined. Test them as gold is tested. They will call on my name, and I'll answer them. When? When do they call on his name? After they go through the fire. And I'll answer them, I'll say, these are my people, and they will say, the Lord is my God. Okay, this language here is covenant language, covenant-making language. This language is used in Ezekiel 37, for instance, like in verse 27, I'll be their God, and they'll be my people. You're familiar with Ezekiel 37, hopefully by now. Revelation 21, he does it again. Let's see. They shall be his people, and God himself will be among them, right? Revelation 21, verse 3. So this is covenant-making language. These people, after passing through the fire and being refined, what happens? They become God's people. He makes a covenant with them here in Zechariah chapter 13, verse 19, because verse 9, because judgment is linked many, many times in the Old Testament with reconciliation and restoration. And this is what we have even in the New Testament. Let me show you a couple of passages. 1 Peter chapter 1, we read that the first century saints were being tested by fire. In 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 17, he says, it's time for judgment to begin with the household of God. What's the purpose of judgment? In 1 Peter 4 verse 17, it's to refine. It's to make them pure. In Malachi chapter 3 as well, in verse 2, he says, who can endure the day of his coming, and who can stand when he appears? For he is like a refiner's fire, and like fuller's soap. He will sit as a smelter and purifier of silver. He will purify the sons of Levi, and refine them like gold and silver, so that they may present to the Lord offerings in righteousness. Then the offering of Judah and Jerusalem will be pleasing to the Lord. He comes as fire. Why? And who can stand? See, that's judgment language. What's the purpose of it, though? To refine, to purify, to make it so that they are pleasing to the Lord. And that's what we have again in Zechariah chapter 12. Again, the reason why you discipline your kids is so that they'll return to you, so that they'll reform their actions, so that they'll be reconciled, not so that you don't kill your kids every time they do something wrong. You try to correct them and reform them, and that's what's happening in Zechariah 13. They pierced him in verse 10 of Zechariah 12, but they're forgiven in Zechariah chapter 13, verse 1. Okay. All right, we have a question here. Hey, Daniel, are not temptation and fear the same as the fire? I guess it depends. I suppose it depends, because I think probably trial may be a better word than temptation, possibly. I think trial might be a better word than temptation. Because temptation, the scripture does say in James 1 that God doesn't tempt any man, but he did test Abraham. So I think you have to be careful of the words temptation and trial, or test. Okay, I'm going to stop the stream there. We are almost at 45 minutes. We did pretty good. If you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat. I'll kind of hang out for like 30 seconds to let you get caught up and to type your question, and then we should be good to go. Fire salt as judgment. I think so, Ashley. I believe so. I'm seeing fire salt as judgment. Fire, for sure. Salt would be the preservation. Like Matthew chapter 5. Judgment or trying. Matthew chapter 5, of course, says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men." So you have this idea of salt becoming tasteless, but salt would be the preservation. They're the preservers of the land. And so it's interesting, whenever they leave the land, when the Romans surround Jerusalem, then the land is destroyed or judged. The salt is, I don't know, Ashley. I'm not sure about Mark chapter 9:49. I was just putting that out before you. Yeah, well, that is Mark 9:50. Oh, everyone will be salted with fire? I don't know about that. Now, the salt in here seems to be the same saying as what Jesus says in Matthew 5. Mark includes that saying here in Mark 9:50, so I'm not sure. That's why I threw it out there, for you to figure it out and let me know. Give me the answer so I can put it in my notes. All right. I think I shall be through. If you need anything, please put it in the comments and I'll answer it in the next video, if possible, if I see it and remember. If I don't remember, I'm sorry. Put it again. Thomas Klein, I use the New American Standard. I use the New American Standard in my primary reading and study. I use the ESV, NIV, New King James, Young's Literal. Did I say New Revised Standard already? And then sometimes the New Living Translation when I am doing like cross-examinations. But mainly I use New American Standard. Let's see. Will not God let them go through temptation? Yes, God will let them go through temptation. And I suppose that could be looked at as being a trying, but then that gets into the discussion of what is God's will. What is it God's will, or does he allow it? And is God allowing somebody to go through temptation the same thing as he tempting them? And so that brings up a lot of philosophical debate about the will of God, which is really intriguing, but I do not have the brain power to solve those problems. At least not today. Maybe in a couple of years. All right. I'm going to be through. Y'all have a great night, and I will talk to you. Wait, what's today? I'll talk to you on Sunday. Quarantine's messing with my mind. Bye-bye.